Employment Relations Trial Periods Amendment Bill, third reading.
I present a legislative statement.
The Honourable Simon Watts.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I present a legislative statement on the Taxation Principles Reporting Act repeal bill.
That legislative statement is published under the authority of the House and can be found on the Parliament website.
I move that the Taxation Principles Reporting Act repeal bill be now read a first time. Mr Speaker, the bill that we are considering today has one simple purpose: to repeal the Taxation Principles Reporting Act 2023. The act it repeals is not an ordinary taxation act. It imposes no taxes, nor does it remove taxes. It neither makes a tax system fairer nor less fair. Right. What it does do, Mr Speaker, is require the Commissioner of Inland Revenue to commit resources to this Make Work program, dreamed up by the former government. In New Zealand, we have a long history of a low-rate, broad-based tax system, and it is fitting that we have principles when it comes to tax that has never been in contention. As the Minister of Revenue, I have signalled very clearly that the principles this government holds when it comes to tax. We want a tax system to be efficient and we want it to be effective. We want it to be focused on simplicity and compliance, making sure people pay their taxes they owe, cracking down on evasion and making it easy to navigate the system, and reduce complexity to reduce cost. We also think that Kiwis should be paying less tax. And I'm proud to say that on this side of the House, we will deliver tax relief. This Act has fundamental flaws beyond the lack of justification for which it was ever passed into law. Firstly, it is the right of an elected government to devise, shape and implement its tax objectives, such as those that I've just articulated. An elected government should not have those ambitions hobbled by the views of an earlier government on what constitutes a fair tax system, especially a Labor government. This Act, Mr Speaker, paints a picture of the previous government's view on taxation, using tax principles that it dreamed up. Yes, we all want to and should strive for a fair tax system. But what is not fair, Mr Speaker, is one view of fairness to crowd out the views of others. That is what this Act does. To be valuable and enduring, these principles, as they are described, need to be universally accepted by tax experts, the public, and across the political spectrum. In this Act, they are not. In the various pieces of feedback the previous government received when they passed this into law, there was a clear objection to the idea that the principles defined in the Act are widely understood or accepted, especially by those people who deal with this on a daily basis. Even the Treasury, Mr Speaker, even the Treasury said it could present a risk to the integrity, and I quote, independence and endurance of the reporting framework, quote, unquote. As I said earlier, this legislation does not make the tax system fairer, however one describes that. It merely describes what a fairness is according to the previous government. It does also not make tax or change tax settings or make anyone pay more or less tax, but it does set the foundation for more taxation, particularly regarding wealth taxes. But what it does do, Mr Speaker, is it requires Inland Revenue to report on the performance of the tax system against these principles. There has been never any justification for why resources should be used to chase down information simply to make a point in regards to the previous government instead of it focused on core taxation services. It might be somewhat confusing there, Mr Speaker, why such a bill, which makes no changes to taxation and merely adds redundant reporting, was passed into law in the first place. To answer that question, one only has to look at the government that produced it. one whose wasteful spending drove an insatiable desire to squeeze every last cent out of the back pockets of hard-working Kiwis. This was a government that worked behind the scenes on wealth taxes and job taxes. And the door is open again, Mr Speaker. Not more than a few weeks after falling out of power, Labor is already back on the tax the people more train. Revenue spokesperson Dr Deborah Russell said it might be time, quote, to seriously look at capital gains. Clearly she has forgotten that her leader has tried to rule that out. Or maybe there has been some information about the latest issue.
Mr Watt, this is a legislative statement. First reading, you're introducing a bill. You are straying away from what the convention is on that. Can I just...
Good. Thank you much, Mr Speaker. The Inland Revenue is a highly respected department with a strong history of managing highly complicated policy and operational areas. This government, through the legislation that we're placing on the table today, will ensure that they are focused on ensuring they have the tools to make our tax system more straightforward, efficient and better overall. We should not be wasting their time putting together reports on the last government's ideas of tax principles. Mr Speaker, this bill repeals a bill that has no place in law, and it is right to consign it to the history as another example of unnecessary bureaucracy. Its repeal cannot come soon enough, and I won't be using any more of the House's time to discuss it. I commend the Taxation Reporting Act repeal bill to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. The Honourable Dr Deborah Russell.
Mr Speaker.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. The Honourable Dr Deborah Russell.
Mr Speaker, so much to say, so little time. It's a little hard to know where to start with that speech from the Minister of Revenue. But where I want to start is with the idea that in actual fact, this bill, repealing the Tax Principles Reporting Act, it does away with an incredibly valuable piece of information that we need in New Zealand's democracy. I want to put the idea out there that as Mr Watt said, this bill does not collect more tax, it does not change how our tax is calculated in any way. But what this bill does, what the Tax Principles Reporting Act does, is it gives us information about our tax system. It tells us how well our tax system is doing. Now that's incredibly important in a democracy. You know, every 3 years we vote. That's part of our democracy. We spend time lobbying the government, we spend time making presentations to select committees, we spend time on petitions and on demonstrations, we engage in our governance at all sorts of levels. That's our democracy. It's a complex and multifaceted beast. But one thing that makes our democracy function better is information, so that people have a good understanding of the issues in play. Now, here's the problem, Mr Speaker. Tax makes up half the budget. It's an incredibly important part of our annual budget process. It's something that people need to understand. It's something that people need to have good information about. And yet most people find it quite mysterious. And it's actually hard to find information about our tax system. Now, Mr Watts asserted that this was redundant reporting, suggesting that we could get all the information that the Tax Principles Reporting Act would give us elsewhere. But I'm going to challenge him on that during the committee stage of the debate to find out where else we could get this information. But I also want to talk about two other things that Mr Watts said. He said that New Zealand has a broad-based, low-rate tax system. It certainly has a low-rate tax system. The proportion of tax as a proportion of GDP is lower than OECD averages. But it does not have a broad-based system. It has big gaps in our tax system, and that's something we do need to address. But there was something else that he asserted. He asserted that what the Taxation Principles Reporting Act does was ask Inland Revenue Department to report against principles that had been, and I quote him, tax principles that it dreamed up, tax principles that were just made up out of nowhere. Mr. Speaker, that's a canard. It's just completely false. These tax principles have a long, long history. And I've brought to the House my trusty copy of Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations from 1776. My well-funded, well-read copy of this really important work. Because sitting in this incredibly important early work of economics and political theory are what are referred to as the 4 canons of taxation. So these, they are now referred to as the four main principles of taxation. And what they give us is how to assess a tax system. So way back in 1776, Adam Smith set out 4 principles of taxation: fairness, certainty, convenience, efficiency. Since then, other principles have been added, but they are widely agreed. They are widely discussed and widely agreed amongst the tax community. There may be some nuance, there may be some detail, but to assert that they are dreamed up out of nowhere is absolutely ridiculous. We do have well-established tax principles. We can use them to judge the effectiveness and of our tax system. And this is exactly what the Taxation Principles Reporting Act was in place to do, was to enable us to have good information so that we could make good judgments about our tax system. And this throwaway government is going to throw away this incredibly useful piece of information. What a way to end the year. I do not commend this bill.
I call Chloe Schwalberg. Madam Speaker, much like Dr. Deborah Russell, I don't really know where to start here, and I'm a bit gutted for the new minister because this is embarrassing, mate. You're scared of the data and evidence that you've made a lot of a song and dance about caring so much about. So let's talk about precisely that. The first report under this legislation is due in 10 days. 2 of those days are public holidays, that is, of course, Christmas and Boxing Day. 2 of those days are weekends, and that leaves 6 ostensible working days. But I'm certain, as with most white-collar jobs across the rest of this country, that those who would be working in the IRD on this would be on holiday probably from tomorrow, which means that all of the work necessary for the first report is done. Yet the Minister is rushing under urgency to repeal the enabling legislation because he is terrified of what that report might in fact behold. And, Madam Speaker, I do have to say that kind of has to leave us with the conclusion that the National Party, the ACT Party and the New Zealand First Party are terrified of the data and evidence that they profess to care so much about. I also just want to refer to some of the comments as made by the Minister in introducing this legislation, that somehow these were these foreign and alien concepts when it comes to tax principles. Those 7 tax principles, mind, that we scrutinised heavily throughout Finance and Expenditure Committee throughout this year, and the National Party could not identify one that they disagreed with. But to that point of how foreign and out the gate these are the comments of our independent advisor from that Finance and Expenditure Committee scrutiny on the initial legislation, Sir Rob McLeod, nonetheless, who said, and I quote, "I would omit the descriptors because the meaning of each design principle is sufficiently well understood on their own." That is not ideological, that is independent advice about the inherent value of each of those tax principles and how they are understood out there within the sector. So there is a fundamental problem here, Madam Speaker, and that is the fundamental problem of the lack of data and evidence that we have consistently reported against in Aotearoa, New Zealand. That has led to an issue of perception, which the National Party proclaimed to care about so much when they were repealing the dual mandate of RBNZ and refocusing things just on that sole mandate. It wasn't about the data or evidence then either, by the way. It was simply about perception and the imputed behaviour of market players. So let's talk about that fundamental issue. And here, I think, and would invite all members of the government to read Max Brashbrook's Too Much Money, published in 2021, within which there is a brilliant graphic contained. It was read by one of your former colleagues, Simon Watts, the Honourable Simon Watts, that was, of course, now the one leading the Chamber of Commerce in Auckland. So this here is a really, really, really important graph. What this tells us is the distribution of wealth that New Zealanders think is ideal. And it looks pretty fair. It looks pretty equitable. It looks as though it's distributed in a relative equitable smattering. Then we have, below that, the distribution of what New Zealanders think the distribution is. So you can see that from the ideal, we deviate into what New Zealanders think it is, and they think it's a lot more unfair than it actually is. But in fact, as reality and the data and evidence, Minister Simon Watts bears out, that things are so much worse than New Zealanders think it is. As you can see here, that is the top 20% of New Zealanders holding far more than 60 to 70% of the wealth of everybody in this country. Of course, this suspicion and this data and this evidence was even more borne out by the High Wealth Individuals Report from IRD and the subsidiary papers from Treasury at the beginning of this year. And that confirmed what New Zealanders have suspected for a really, really long time, that our tax system is fundamentally unfair, and it results in the aggregation of wealth in the top 311 families of approximately $85 billion. That is more than the bottom 2.5 million New Zealanders combined hold. And what that IRD report told us, Minister Watts, is that that is not an accident. It is a consequence of a tax system which sees the wealthiest New Zealanders pay effectively half the tax rate of our nurses, of our firefighters, of our frontline essential workers, of those who work in early childhood, of our teachers, of the average New Zealander. So what we are standing here today debating under urgency is a repeal of a bill that is largely already done from a government that pretends to care about data and evidence but spits in the face of public access to that information on. So I'm at a loss, Madam Speaker, and really we will continue to prosecute this case throughout Committee of the Whole because the Minister should be embarrassed.
Madam Chair.
Stevenson.
Thank you. ACT will be supporting this bill. And the hypocrisy from the other side this morning is staggering. Staggering. Madam Chair.
Point of order.
Point of order, the Honourable Grant Robertson.
I recognise that the member is a relatively new member, but the use of that term is one that's been ruled out by many presiding officers, and I'd ask that he be asked to withdraw it.
I agree with the point of order. The member will withdraw and apologise.
And apologise to the House. The bill that we're repealing was done without proper public policy consultation. The then Minister announced that it would be widely consulted on, and it wasn't. It didn't even follow the IRD's own principles for developing policy. The generic tax policy process was not followed. If the former government, Madam Speaker, had taken the time to actually widely consult on this bill, maybe there would have been some tax principles that could have been agreed and reported on. It was not done in an appropriate way. It was not done with a full and long select committee process. And the submitters overwhelmingly did not support it. You had accounting societies, the Law Society, all saying that it was not a bill that they would support. If the former government had actually taken the time, we could have potentially agreed on some principles that would have been useful.
I know everyone is tired and this is the end of the year, but there are people in the community who would like to hear this debate with a little less background noise. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As I said, if the time had been taken, perhaps a set of principles. ACT is very interested in tax, as I'm sure everyone would know. And if time had been taken, perhaps this could have been a useful piece of legislation. But it wasn't. It wasn't. And we are not going to support it. And we want it repealed immediately so that something that wasn't properly consulted on and didn't have the support of the majority of submitters What we should be looking at is actually having our tax principles. Actually, Dr. Russell made some very good points about trying to have some consistency around tax principles. So, yeah, thank you.
Keep going.
I know. I'm just letting them get it out.
It's your call.
No, thank you. I appreciate that, Madam Speaker. Look, as I've said, we do not support this bill. We do support this bill, amending this act that we think was ill-conceived, inappropriately consulted on, and did not have widespread support. So I commend this bill to the House.
Point of order.
Seek leave of the House to table the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee's report on the taxation reporting bill.
Is that available?
It is, but it appears the members of the government have not read it.
I call the Honourable Grant Robertson.
Madam Speaker, thank you very much for the opportunity, somewhat earlier than I'd expected, to speak on this bill. Mr Watts, in his opening speech, I think articulated a very important point about any piece of legislation that comes forward. He said that the reason why the government wants to repeal the Tax Principles Act is because, quote, the principles are not universally accepted by tax experts. Well, I've got news for Mr Watts. His government's program of tax cuts is not actually universally accepted by tax experts. So we'll ditch that now, will we, as well? We'll get rid of that because it's not universally accepted. You see, the thing is, Mr Watts actually doesn't have a reason for getting rid of this legislation other than who brought it in. That's it. It's the only thing, because the reporting and the information that is provided under this Act, I would have thought was exactly the thing that parties opposite would want. Information in the public arena about our tax system. Now, we all know that there are people in this House who know the intricate and arcane details of our taxation system. I'm thinking about tax lawyers and people who've lectured in tax policy, but most New Zealanders don't. Most New Zealanders don't have access to that kind of information. And actually, being able to understand our tax system, being able to understand how tax is collected, what basis it's collected on, how that affects core principles of how we live our lives, is relevant and important information. And the tax principles as listed in the Act that is being repealed by this bill are ones that I think universally, to coin Mr Watts' phrase, are ones that people would want to understand. Equity, efficiency, integrity, compliance costs, certainty, flexibility and adaptability. Now, we will disagree across this House about tax policy and about what policy we think should be implemented at any given moment. But what I would have hoped we would not disagree about, Madam Speaker, was the importance of transparency and the importance of information being available to New Zealanders to be able to understand this core and critical part of our financial system. And, Madam Speaker, I've heard today already, and fair warning for Mr Watts, these will be questions that come up in the Committee of the Whole stage. I've heard from him that there's a bureaucracy involved here. We know exactly how many people are involved. It's 2.5 FTE. That, as Chloe Swarbrick has said on multiple occasions during this debate already, is 0.06% of the staff of Inland Revenue. Less than 0.1 of 1% of the staff of Inland Revenue to actually help all New Zealanders understand their tax system. That is a very, very small price to pay for that information to be available. But, Madam Speaker, you know what makes this all so much worse is that the work on the first report has undoubtedly already been completed. As has already been pointed out by previous speakers, we are towards the end of the working year. IRD are a very effective and efficient department, and they will have completed this work. It will exist. And Mr Watts should also be warned that we'll be asking about that when we come to the Committee of the Whole House stage. So this is a government that rails against wastage. The work's been done. and they want to waste it. They want to say, you know what? Even though we oppose this legislation that the previous government brought in, we're going to make certain that the work that's been done on it is wasted. They are actively passing a piece of legislation today to ensure that the work of the public service is wasted. What a remarkable thing for the first act of the Minister of Revenue to be, to come to this House and to take away a piece of legislation that means more New Zealanders will understand the tax system, that will provide more transparency about our taxation system. That's the priority of the government here. Among all of the bizarre things that they brought in front of this House over the last couple of weeks, this is the one. This piece of legislation is the one that makes the least sense to me. They don't like workers, so they're going to do the legislation that we just had before. But this one's about the transparency and of our taxation system. Every member across there should want to know what is in this report, or at the very least give New Zealanders the opportunity to hear it. And they are afraid of what's in it, and we will be strongly opposing this legislation.
David Seymour.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member who's just resumed a seat for the speech she gave, although I have to say I don't think the last 9 minutes were really necessary. Mr Speaker, I stand in support of the Taxation Principles Reporting Act repeal bill, and let me take an opportunity to respond to some of the things that we've just heard. We've heard time and again that the wealthiest New Zealanders pay half the tax rate of the average New Zealander. We've heard that time and again, repeated by people on the opposition benches. And I wouldn't describe it as lying, because as Chloe Swarbrick recently found, you're not supposed to say that. In fact, for people who want to watch on replay, you can see the high and mighty Chloe Swarbrick, who tells us we're all inexperienced and have no data, come into the House at midnight and apologise to the House for not knowing the most basic rules. But, Mr Speaker, she also repeats continuously this untrue assertion that the wealthiest New Zealanders pay half the tax rate of the average New Zealander. And let me tell you where that comes from. It comes from a fishing expedition that the previous government sent the IRD on to survey 311 high net worth New Zealanders. And they calculated how much money those people had and how much their paper assets increased over a period of time and how much tax they paid. And they divided the tax they paid by how much their paper wealth had increased to try and calculate what they described as an effective tax rate. Well, the problem with that is, Madam Speaker, that if that was really the standard that was applied to New Zealanders, then take a year like 2021. The median house price in 2021 under the previous government, when it lost control of monetary policy, lost control of inflation, the median house price increased by $135,000. And that means that the average person had a $45,000 tax bill. You know, that's what they would have paid if we took this thinking seriously. If we were seriously going to say that every time your paper assets go up, such as house prices increase, that you are liable to pay tax on that, then we would have a very different tax system. And actually, that is the policy of the Greens. The question is whether it is the policy of the Labor Party. Does the Labor Party want to join the Greens in saying that people should pay tax on their paper asset gains? Should there be a tax on your house? And I see Grant Robertson waving the bill at me. Well, I'm responding to members who have contributed to the debate. And if Grant Robertson doesn't like the members contributing to the debate, he better think about how to win back Wellington Central from them. That's the real problem he's got. So, Madam Speaker, that is the real question about tax principles. That's the real question about tax principles, Madam Speaker. Are we serious about taxing wealth? because the Green Party is very clear that they're coming after your house. And I remember debating Julianne Genter in Epsom one day years ago, and the question was asked, how should a person who has a lot of assets, perhaps a widow who has recently lost their partner, how should they pay for the Greens' wealth tax on their house? And Julianne Genter told the audience, oh, well, maybe they could get a reverse mortgage. And you could hear the air getting sucked out of the room. She hasn't said it again, I've got to say. But, Madam Speaker, that is where these tax principles take us. The problem that the Green Party has, and the Labor Party for that matter, is that none of their own policies would actually adhere to these principles, because these parties want to start using tax not as a way to raise revenue, not in a way to be fair, not in a way to be efficient. They want to add new taxes. They want to add new taxes that will go after your assets, and if you don't have the money to pay, they'll put you on a reverse mortgage and start bleeding you dry. That's what these guys really believe. And, Madam Speaker, that's why this Tax Principles Reporting Act that we're repealing today makes no difference, because the parties opposite who brought this bill in then went and wrote tax policies and campaigned on policies that would never be consistent with the Tax Principles Reporting Act. And I see a new member over there from the Greens who's frowning at me, thinking, does this make sense? Was that really our policy? Well, let me explain to her how it works. Actually, the Green Party's policy is that you pay 1.5% wealth tax on assets in trust. So you've got two people, one owns a home that they'll put in trust. And if you've put your home in a trust because you're worried that your kid is getting married and you don't want them to lose their asset in a settlement when it's their inheritance from you, you pay 1.5%. The person that keeps the house in their own ownership doesn't pay the 1.5%. So that's one Green Party policy that would fail the horizontal equity test. So they voted for the bill and then they campaigned on a policy that would fail the first test. And here's another one. They say if you have $4 million of wealth, you pay 2.5% as a couple, but you pay only 2.5% on $2 million of wealth if you're single. So what happens to an older couple who might have $3 million of wealth that they worked their whole life for? They've got a nice house, they've got some retirement savings. Their $3 million is not taxable because it's under $4 million. All of a sudden, one partner dies. That can happen with elderly couples. And all of a sudden, one of those people is liable for 2.5% on the extra $1 million, $25,000 a year tax bill for that elderly lady who's grieving the loss of her husband under the Greens tax policy. Now, is that equitable? Is that equitable? Oh, here we go.
We got a point of order.
Speaker, I just wanted to raise with you a question, because it seems to me that the member currently speaking is not speaking to the bill at all, but is talking about imagined conversations from 10 years ago, policies from other parties that they campaigned on. I mean, very interesting, and I'm glad that he's promoting our policies, but it's not really in the bill.
Thank you for the point of order.
Speaking to the point of order, Madam Speaker.
Can I just, first of all, I'm actually hearing the member who has been on his feet talking about tax principles, and the bill is about tax principles reporting. So unless the member has something further to add to the point of order, I'd ask you to carry on.
Oh, I do, Madam Speaker. In raising the point of order, Julianne Genter said that the conversation, I assume that she was referring to events where she told a group of my Epsom constituents to get a reverse mortgage. She said that was an imagined conversation. I just want to put on the record that actually happened, and for her not to take me at my word.
Okay, well, thank you. That's
wrong.
not a point of order, and sorry, I was talking. I missed that comment when I was speaking to the clerk. So. Right.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I think people watching at home can take heed from the fact that the Green Party is the only party I know that has just tried to shut down a discussion about its own tax policy. But it's kind of understandable. It's kind of understandable. And the point, if Julianne Genter wasn't following along, is that the Green Party voted for this Tax Principles Act and then ran the election on policies, and had they been successful, would have no doubt tried to implement policies that violate the Act. And that, Madam Speaker, is why we oppose it, because even the people who believe in it don't follow it. Why would it make any difference for this Parliament to require the IRD to go to great expense to prepare a report every year when even the people whose idea it was don't agree with it and don't follow it? If it can't have any influence on the Green Party, who think it's desperately necessary to have this law, then how can it possibly have an effect on anyone else? They don't do it. Why would anyone else? Madam Speaker, there's another point that maybe needs to be considered. The Labor and Green parties were in government for 6 years, and not a single report was produced under the Tax Principles Reporting Act. Because as we heard earlier, the first report is due at the end of this year. So, Madam Speaker, how is it possible that the Labor Party and the Green Party are sitting here desperately telling us that we have to have this legislation when they themselves governed without it for 6 years? They cannot be sincere when they believe that this is important. Madam Speaker, on this side of the House, we are interested in saving the taxpayer money. We are interested in a smaller, more efficient government. We are interested in removing red tape, regulation and bureaucracy wherever we find it. And taking a few hours to debate the removal of the Taxation Principles Reporting Act is a very good example of this government getting to work and saving money so that people sitting at home can actually have some more money left at the end of the week and spend less of their time funding pointless bureaucracy and stupid laws that even the people who came up with it and supported it do not believe in, because even they don't follow it in their own policy. As an added Christmas bonus, the Green Party are over there and they're not going to be taxing a house. Thank you, Madam Speaker.